Okay, this is Chapter 5 on drug law penalties. Let's get right into the material. One thing I want to say is that, and this is true for all of these chapters as we're moving through them, that typically I replace the statistics that are listed in the textbook with numbers that are more recent. Because there's always a lag in statistics. Even the freshest ones that I can find are not brand new. So focus on my numbers that I give in these lectures more so than the older numbers that you're going to see in the textbook. And when the numbers are different, just realize that I'm getting more recent numbers. I'm doing the best I can. The stats are always a couple years behind even the newest ones, but at least it's not 5+ years old. Okay, speaking of stats, let's jump into the first one right here. Roughly 1 million people, just to give you a rough number, in America are arrested for drug crimes each year. That's around 16% of all arrests. Okay, so it's a common crime, a commonly arrested crime, as you'll see, and we'll put it into a little more context, comparing it to some other types of crimes, and we'll add a little discussion to that, and I'll try to give maybe a little more explanation and context than maybe the textbook does. Next point, the total number of people in state prisons in the United States who are serving a sentence for a drug crime is around 176,000. This number represents about 13.1% of all state prisoners. And I focus on stats from state prisons because that's where the bulk of prisoners is in state prisons. Also, many are in jails, which are more temporary facilities, for folks who are perhaps awaiting trial, who didn't get bail, and people who are serving sentences for shorter crimes, typically less than a year. And so there's a lot of people in jails on any particular day too, but that's more of a fluid situation. A lot of people in and out, and the numbers are not as good for jails. So state prisons is really the good level to focus on when you're trying to get at the bulk of inmates who are going to be incarcerated for some time. So 176,000, 13% of all state prisoners. So a significant percentage of people in prison, but certainly not plurality or majority or anything like that. The number of people in state prisons for drug crimes has actually decreased by about 11% since 2010. So the image that we typically get is is that of mass incarceration, and indeed there are a lot of people incarcerated in the United States. But those trends have been slightly down. Now, that's not a rapid decline, but quite a bit of this decline has been in the numbers here since 2010. But a lot of this decline has happened, say, maybe in the past, less than 10 years. The number of prisoners in federal prisons serving a sentence for a drug crime has decreased over the past few years as well. So federal crime trends are similar. In fact, the federal prison population has decreased about 10% since 2018. So those have been the trends. That's an overall theme from this chapter, is that we're turning away to some extent, not in a dramatic, huge way. Depends on what you're talking about, but overall, we've been heading in a smaller way away from the get tough policies of the 80s and 90s and beyond, and with focus on deterrence, on incapacitation, shifting to a focus a little bit more towards rehabilitation, treatment, that sort of thing. This is due to a combination of factors. This small decrease in incarceration, including changes in drug laws. So there's been some changes there, and also sentencing guidelines, as well as increased focus on rehabilitation and reentry programs. Now, I'm not going to spend time, there's a lot in the chapter to cover, and I've got to cut out, somewhere so that these lectures don't become too long. Now, one thing I want you to look at, though, this diagram that you see here, you often see in criminal justice textbooks, because it's a really nice single graph which shows the flow of people as they move through the criminal justice system, all the way from the occurrence of a crime through it being reported and an arrest occurring, police responding, an arrest occurring, and then as they moved through the system all the way to the end. And so, and you can see here that at the bottom they show how it's somewhat different for juvenile offenders, and that juvenile offenders are part of a separate system. Anyway, so there's a lot there. Please review that. You've probably seen this before. Review it, familiarize yourself with it. And let me ask you to do this as sort of a mental exercise or a learning experience. Look this over and think about how this would be relevant to drug crimes. The complexity of the system, the many points by which cases can be dropped, that a person could be diverted out of the system to something else other than the criminal justice system. And so this is particularly relevant for drug crimes. So think about that as you look through the flow of the system here. The textbook doesn't stress one thing. They point to those different stages in the criminal justice system, but they don't stress a super important point about the criminal justice system, and that is that most of these cases don't flow all the way through to completion at the end of that graph, but rather 90 to 95%, the vast majority of cases, are handled through the plea bargaining process, where the lawyers, both on the prosecution side and the defense side, make a deal. The defendant gets a reduced sentence. Some charges might be dropped or reduced, and in exchange for a guilty plea. And then this is a way to avoid going to court. And so this is the way it's usually handled. It's usually not in front of the judge. It's usually not all the way through the system as that graph shows. And so that's a very important thing. And what it often results in is reduced penalties for what the person was originally arrested for. And that's relevant because a person could get arrested for whatever sort of drug crime, but end up with something that is less serious than the original charges. Now, on the other side of that, if the person is actually truly innocent, then they may be making a deal to get a penalty, some consequence, negative consequences for something they didn't do. So that's the bad side of it. If it's a case where there's enough evidence where the defense lawyer thinks you're going to be found guilty, even though you didn't do it, then you may end up feeling like you have to make a deal, plead guilty to some lesser offense, and then you're serving time or whatever the penalty is for something that you didn't actually do. So that's on the other side of this plea bargaining. 2021 FBI data. So again, I tried to find the newest I could find. Never as new as we wish it were. There were a total of about, rounding up, about 1.2 million arrests in the United States. So when I gave that 1 million number, that's just kind of rough for kind of an average year, just a big round number to throw out there. But when we get specific for the most recent year, 2021, we're talking about close to 1.2 million. Now, again, for context, we want to bring up some other types of crimes. If we look at another sort of drug sort of crime, and here we're talking about alcohol, driving under the influence. For 2019, the newest data I could find, that's closer to right at 1 million arrests. See, so you can compare that and you can say, okay, so one type of drug, alcohol, results in, close to as many arrests as all other sorts of drugs, illegal drugs combined. So these DUI arrests are very common, almost as common as all the other drug arrests combined. So that gives you a little bit of context there about the problem of driving under the influence. Now, I found for 2022 FBI data on violent crimes, and there were a total, again, of a roughly 1 million arrests for violent crimes in the United States. And when we're talking about violent crimes specifically, what do we mean about that? What do we mean? What gets included? That would be murder, non-negligent manslaughter, forcible rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. So these are serious violent crimes. We're not talking about minor scuffles, minor crimes, threats, that kind of thing. And the textbook stresses how large the drug arrest numbers are up against much more serious crimes, or at least on average, compared to these violent crimes, that the numbers are not too far apart here. And the textbook stresses that. But one rule we have to keep in mind to provide context here is that this is a rule of criminology, that the more minor the offense, the more often it happens. The more serious offense, like murder on the extreme serious side, the less often it happens. So violent crime, you would expect violent crime, especially serious violent crime, to not happen as often as drug offenses, because there's a lot more people who are using drugs illegally out there, or selling, trafficking, manufacturing drugs. Though there's a lot more of that going on than there is serious violence. And it's as you would expect, because the more serious the crime, the fewer people who engage in that. See, we're talking about millions of arrests for these different types of crimes. For murder itself, it's more on the order of, say, 20,000, a much smaller number than a million. And because it's such a serious crime, it's just something that not many people, comparatively speaking, do. So that's just to give some context there. According to the most recent FBI data, there were a total of, again, around a million arrests for property crimes. And for property crimes, we're talking about the more serious property crimes, burglary, breaking into somebody's house or into their car, into a commercial establishment, a business, breaking into it with the intentions of stealing items from there. Larceny, theft, the more serious larceny thefts they're including here, and also stealing automobiles. So this is more serious property crimes. And that's about 1 million. And so we can see that it's an interesting fact that these major categories of crime, property, violence, DUIs, drugs, very roughly in the same neighborhood, each of those, in terms of frequency. And that's kind of an interesting coincidence, sort of. Let's move on here. Heroin and cocaine are the most commonly involved drugs in arrests for sales and manufacturing. But if you're talking about possession arrests, that happens most often with marijuana. Again, not too surprising, because there's going to be a lot more people in possession of marijuana in the country at any given time than the more serious drugs of heroin and cocaine. So that's not surprising when you think about it. Think about it in terms of commonness, frequency of the crimes being committed, and then a certain fraction of those are going to end up in an arrest, because you get discovered. The cops have probable cause, they have the evidence, witnesses, the drug itself that warrants an arrest. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, or BJS, 46% of inmates in federal prisons were serving for drug-related offenses in 2022. Again, the newest numbers I could find. And as this theme has come up before, that it's very common in federal prison to be there for a drug crime, because that's a type of crime that the federal government is very concerned about, particularly trafficking sales among different states, operations that are big enough that cross state lines. According to the BJS, 12.5% of state prisons were serving for drug-related offenses in 2021. Again, the newest data that I could find. So a lot smaller percent in the state prisons compared to the federal prisons, because there's state prisons holds a lot more, different types of prisoners, property crime, prisoners, violent crime prisoners, etc. It's important to note that the percentage of inmates serving sentences for drug-related offenses has declined in recent years as the focus of the criminal justice system has shifted towards addressing more serious offenses. Let's pick this up and continue in part 2.